Welcome to George Grosz, the Stickman, in our series Flight or Fight: Stories of Artists Under Repression. This event is a collaboration with the Heckscher Museum of Art in Huntington, New York. I'm Rachel Stern, Executive Director of the Fritz Ascher Society for Persecuted, Ostracized, and Banned Art in New York. Today, I'm honored to introduce our esteemed speaker, Dr. Karli Wurzelbacher. She's the chief curator of the Heckscher Museum of Art, where she has curated more than a dozen exhibitions. She has also worked at the Baltimore Museum of Art in Maryland and the Columbus Museum of Art in Ohio. Wurzelbacher has published on artists including Grosz, Courtney M. Leonard, Joe Mitchell, Louise Nevelson, Joseph Stella, and Jack Whitten. She earned a PhD in art history from the University of Delaware. After the presentation, there will be time for Q&A, so please post your questions. Welcome, Karli.
Hi, Rachel. Hi, everyone who's watching. Thank you so much to Rachel and the Fritz Ascher Society for inviting me to speak about George Grosz's Stickmen series. The Heckscher Museum of Art is currently presenting George Grosz, the Stickmen, which will be on view in Huntington, Long Island, where Grosz lived, through September 1st. And if you're listening today and you live in the region or you have a trip to New York planned, I hope you will visit to see the art in person. Many of the works are watercolors borrowed from European private collectors and from American museums. And because they're works on paper, they are light sensitive. And this means that they will probably not be all together and on view again for many years, if not decades. So if you can make the trip, I hope you will. The Stickmen exhibition was organized with the George Grosz Museum in Berlin. And that's what we're seeing on the screen here. And I want to be sure to thank my colleagues there, including the people listed on the screen, for their partnership. And some of the information that I will be sharing today is really drawn from their research and their catalog essay contributions. And if you're interested in the book, it is available for purchase online. George Grosz was an internationally renowned political artist who emigrated from Germany to the United States in 1933, just days before Adolf Hitler became chancellor. He created the Stickmen series in Huntington, where he lived from 1947 until shortly before his death. Depicting hollow, starved figures in a post-apocalyptic world, the watercolors respond to the atrocities of World War II, including the Holocaust and the dropping of atomic bombs. In the series, Grosz questions, but ultimately affirms, the power of political art to impact society. This exhibition is the first dedicated to the Searing Stickmen series since it debuted in New York City in 1948. And as I think you will agree, as we continue talking and looking, more than 75 years later, Grosz's warning against global conflict remains frighteningly relevant. In my talk today, I will provide an overview of Grosz's life and work and explore the imagery of the Stickmen series. And I will also consider how the context of wartime and post-war Long Island informed the series. And I will touch on Grosz's continuing legacy in Huntington. Grosz was born in Berlin in 1893, and he grew up in what is now Poland. After attending art school, he served in the German army during World War I. Following the war, he began creating art that criticized contemporary life and politics. He depicted injured veterans, desperate sex workers, and grotesque officials at a time when Germany was devastated by debt, hyperinflation, and political unrest. And here I'm showing you an image of his work from this period, and also a photograph of him at a legal hearing in Berlin. In 1920, Grosz helped to organize the first International Dada Fair. Dada artists embraced nonsense and ridiculed the so-called rational thought and progress that they felt contributed to society's ills. Grosz was also associated with the Neue Sachlichkeit, or New Objectivity artists, whose work presented an unvarnished image of the world around them. He described his art as, quote, a reaction against a humanity gone mad. In the 1930s, the Nazis denounced his work as degenerate art and stripped him of his German citizenship. This drawing, entitled Cross Section, was reproduced in a book, Ecce Homo, of 100 of Grosz's early works on paper. We can see how he used angular lines to depict the overlap of injured veterans, the despairing poor, and the complacent middle class, showing us a real cross-section of society. Grosz's publisher printed approximately 10,000 copies of Ecce Homo, allowing it to reach a large, wide audience. In 1923, however, the government confiscated 34 of the original drawings, and they tried Grosz, put him on trial, for circulating obscene material. In the 1930s, copies of Ecce Homo were destroyed in Nazi book burnings. And as an interesting aside, one of the publishers of Ecce Homo was actually American-born. His name was Julian Gumpers. And after leaving Berlin, Gumpers moved to Huntington on Long Island. So this may be one of the connections that brought Grosz to the region much later. Eclipse of the Sun is another masterpiece of political art from this period, and it is part of the collection of the Heckscher Museum of Art. It's one of our most meaningful and powerful works. As signaled by the $sign darkening the sun, a symbol of life, the painting critiques the greed and the violence of Germany's military, politicians, and industrialists. The painting's tilted perspective, dissonant color, and ambiguous sense of space underscore the instability of the period following World War I. In the painting, Grosz portrays mindless bureaucrats, so these are the literally headless figures, in a grim setting, surrounding the decorated General Paul von Hindenburg, who was field marshal during World War I, served as second president of the Weimar Republic, and would later name Adolf Hitler chancellor in 1933. Whispering in his ear is an industrialist carrying weapons and railroads. A donkey representing the German people stands near a bloody sword and listens with big ears, yet wears blinders of ignorance. Confined and stepped on at the bottom corner, a fearful face of a youth juxtaposed with a skeleton warns of the fate of future generations. In the summer of 1932, during the Great Depression, and after a productive and tumultuous decade spent in Berlin, Grosz visited the United States of America for the first time. He lived in Manhattan, teaching at the Art Students League and opening his own school of painting. He then went back to Berlin in the fall of 1932, but in January 1933, he returned to America with his family just as the Nazi Party rose to power. The family moved to Bayside, which is a village in the New York City borough of Queens. It's actually where I live now. And as recently as the 1920s, bucolic Bayside had been home to celebrities, including silent film star Gloria Swanson and the former heavyweight boxing champion James "Gentleman Jim" Corbett. As Grosz would have witnessed while walking from his home to the train station, however, land was increasingly being subdivided for residential development. While commuting to his teaching job in Manhattan, Grosz sometimes spent the short ride to Penn Station drawing his fellow commuters. So here's a map to give you a sense of where Bayside and later Douglaston, another town I'll speak about, where they're located, both on the Long Island Sound and in relationship to Manhattan. So from 1936 to 1946, the Grosz family lived one stop further along east along the rail line in Douglaston, Queens. They remained there in a waterfront home throughout World War II. The Grosz family received direct news of the state of affairs and atrocities that were taking place in Germany and in Europe via letters, and also refugees who visited or stayed with them. These reports, firsthand accounts, undoubtedly fueled Grosz's art, including the Stickmen series. The impact of the global conflict was also palpable around him on Long Island. Grosz talked of sensing the winds of war from across the Atlantic. He said, quote, "At night, I hear Europe. I hear cries of fear from thousands of miles away, the smell of distant fires and blood." He also said, quote, "Walking by the Sound, it often seemed to me that I saw a faraway shine of ghastly fires, and a feeling of utter horror crept up in me." Grosz was speaking figuratively, of course, yet from his home, he did have a clear view of Bayside's Fort Totten across the water, which was a military installation. And he likely also observed air traffic from nearby LaGuardia Airport. And both of these places played a role in World War II. The Long Island Sound also connects to New York Harbor. And it was through New York Harbor that more than 3 million troops and millions of tons of supplies were shipped to the battlefield. During the Nazi era and throughout the war, Grosz continued to produce a range of artwork in an attempt to find traction to make sales in the commercial art world. And here I'm showing you an example of his cityscapes and also of a nude in a summer landscape. Some of Grosz's peers and some art historians have felt that Grosz's work lost its political bite after he immigrated to America, began teaching, and moved to the suburbs. A 1943 profile on Grosz in the New Yorker magazine joked that he, quote, "has a wife, 2 sons, a dog, a 2-story stucco house, a rack of pipes, a garden, a lawnmower, and a workshop. And he occasionally runs for a train like any other commuter. He hopes that all this makes him so overwhelmingly suburban that Hitler could no longer recognize the artist who offended him." The profile continues, quote, "Grosz's efforts to perfect his role of the American suburbanite are constantly upset by his own nature. His past rides him hard. He cannot help indulging fancies, which his neighbors might regard as extreme," end quote. So there's this tension between George Grosz, the suburban father living in Douglaston, and the work that he's creating. His art, including the Stickmen series, confirms that he did remain committed to engaging with politics after he came to the US. I'm going to show you this image several times because I think it's so rich. But here we see him working in his home studio, which was an upstairs bedroom in his home. And he's painting a work entitled Cain, or Hitler in Hell. And Cain, of course, comes from the book of Genesis. He is the child of Adam and Eve who kills his brother Abel. According to Grosz, he is portraying Hitler here as, quote, "a fascist monster or an apocalyptic beast." Interestingly, this photograph was reproduced in the popular American press. So Grosz and his work were often covered in Life magazine and Time magazine. But the painting itself, Cain or Hitler in Hell, remained with the Grosz family until 2019 or 2020, when the German Historical Museum in Berlin announced that they had purchased it. So that's an example of how his work was very visible, but not necessarily commercially viable. This is another work that Grosz created during World War II, and it's on view now at the show in Huntington, thanks to a loan from our neighboring Long Island institution, Hofstra University. The painting is titled "A Mighty One on a Little Outing, Surprised by Two Poets." So the mighty one is this central figure, which is a composite of Adolf Hitler and Joseph Stalin, the dictatorial ruler of the Soviet Union. The two grotesque figures toward the bottom are groveling at the feet of this dictator. And the dictator is holding behind his back a bloody whip that he has been using to whip these figures. And the whip that you can see behind his back also looks like a devil's tail. One of the poets offers up a lyre, a symbol of music or song, and the other holds writing materials or literature marked with a swastika. So in this allegory, Grosz mocks art that serves totalitarian regimes. And in creating it, he demonstrates that he's not doing that, that he's willing to use his own work to criticize those in power. As I turn now to a discussion of the Stickmen series, I want to revisit this image of Grosz one more time and ask you to look at the work hanging in the background. Because this work, which is known as The Poor and the Rich, or The Fat and the Thin, is really a prototypical stickmen work. And so the stickmen family that we see hints at the emaciated gray figures that will come to dominate the series he creates after World War II, but they're already nascent in his mind in 1941. For the most part, Grosz created the Stickmen series in Huntington, Long Island, where he moved with his family in 1947 after the conclusion of the war. As I have been saying, the watercolors depict dehumanized figures wandering through a dystopian world. Created as the Cold War set in, the Stickmen series expresses Grosz's loss of faith in humanity. Here you can see on the screen where an arrow pointing to where he used to live in Douglaston, and then pointing to Huntington, which is further east on Long Island, but still in proximity to New York City. And it's in New York City in 1948 that Grosz debuted the Stickmen for the first time at the Associated American Artists Galleries. And on the postcard for the show, which you're seeing on the screen, Grosz explains what the stickmen are. He says, quote, "The stickmen are men who are called by numbers and not by names, men who wear slave collars, gray men in a gray world following empty, meaningless banners." As the title of this work, Holocaust, makes clear, the Stickmen series responded to the atrocities of the Holocaust. And Grosz knew about the Holocaust and what was happening because of those firsthand reports from letters and also from friends who survived concentration camps and later came to the US. At the same time, all of the Stickmen works are functioning on so many levels. So on the one hand, they are rooted in real world events, but they're also metaphorical and philosophical, and they speak to the state of humanity as a whole. So for example, George Grosz said that the series does not portray any single location or any specific event. He said, quote, "The ruins are not those of specific places, but the mirror of a crumbling civilization." So while we see in the post-apocalyptic landscape rubble that looks very much like bombed out cities. Grosz is also saying that this is symbolic of the rubble and the wreck of humanity as a whole. Another work in the Stickman series is called The Enemy of the Rainbow, and it depicts a solitary stickman in front of what appears to be a concentration camp. And the stickman is holding a makeshift weapon. So it's kind of like a blade that has been tied to a stick. And he is holding a rainbow flag. And you'll have to remember here Grosz's comment about gray men in a gray world and their empty, meaningless banners. So the rainbow, which in nature appears after a storm, so it's a symbol of hope that life will go on. It's a symbol of nature. It's a symbol of hope and joy. All of these things are impossible in the world of the stickman. And that's what Grosz is conveying here. To our contemporary eyes, it's important to say that the rainbow flag may call to mind the pride flag, the LGBTQ plus pride flag. However, the pride flag was not invented until almost three decades later in 1978. Throughout the Stickman series, Grosz's dehumanized beings are at once victims and perpetrators. So there are no good guys and bad guys in the stickmen world. Everyone is in the same boat. Everyone has forfeited their humanity. In this work called The Battalion of the Whole, the figures are unchained, but they still wear shackles around their necks. They band together under a bloody flag with a hole at its center, and we'll talk more about the hole. Their mouths are sewn shut. Sometimes their ears are covered. And also small roots dangle from the bottom of their feet. So they are literally uprooted from their homes in the same way that many people, including Grosz himself, were displaced by World War II. At the same time, they've been uprooted from their humanity. They've been uprooted from history. They have been uprooted from accepted norms of thought and of behavior, basically from civilization. Grosz often shows the stickmen in groups, marching in lockstep. He explained, quote, "In another period, I might have painted men as heroic figures, great soldiers storming great walls. But instead, through a sieve that is the history of my period, these heroic figures have been reduced to robot stickmen, and I can see only this regimentation, this world without meaning, this emptiness and frustration, this totalitarian gray world of order and destruction of all individuality." As we've been seeing, the figures in Grosz's stickmen are distinguished by their very thin bodies and even their transparent bodies that we can see right through. They also have insect-like features, including beady eyes and spindly arms and legs. And again, they're banding together in this battle for resources. One of the insect figures in the center here, and in other works, they've picked up stones, weapons. And they are swarming as one. So this work is called The Insect Men. So again, these are not even people anymore. They're kind of shells of people or former people. They are a swarm of creatures, and they are struggling through, and they're disintegrating into this fiery world and this morass surrounding them. And throughout the series, Grosz's use of watercolor, I think, is really inspired because you can get these thin, transparent washes, and you can also get flecks of paint that look like blood or mud. So I think the decision to work in watercolor, again, is conveying information and is very important to the series. One of Grosz's friends during his lifetime described the stickmen as, quote, hornet people and as a plague of locusts. Another called them, quote, a vermin that eats the earth bare and kills any living thing. Grosz often juxtaposed the stickmen with larger bodies in order to highlight inequality. Relying on negative stereotypes, he often used fat figures to symbolize greed and materialism. This imagery reflects Grosz's experience of the years following World War II. While he was relatively safe and comfortable on Long Island, members of his extended family and his mother were starving in bombed out Berlin. Grosz would send them food packages and clothing, and they would send back letters that illustrated their struggle to survive. So what you're seeing on the left of your screen is actually not by George Grosz, it's by his brother-in-law. And this was mailed in a letter back to Grosz to thank him for a food package. And so in the letters he's receiving, there's dancing food, and food is coming to life in kind of this hunger fever dream. And that imagery certainly had a big impact on the work that Grosz created in the Stickmen series. Some of the core imagery, like food and the lack of it, but also tattered clothes and rats, are traced directly to these letters. And Grosz later would summarize the life of his family in post-war Berlin. And this is what he said, quote, "They are wretchedly cold and hungry. No fire, no electricity, no water, no soap left, stench everywhere. Nearly everyone over 50 is condemned to dying slowly and wasting away. My mother and her sister perished during one of the last big bombing raids. Any number of corpses killed by bombs still lie under the building rubble. Cadaver rats as thick as an arm dash around openly in the rubble." So this is post-war Berlin. I wanted to point to, this is for me, one of the most disturbing images in the Stickmen series. And here, a group of stickmen have captured a being and have killed it and are eating it. And it's a kind of human pig hybrid. The title of the work is The Crucified Ham. And it's important to note that the Stickmen series imagery, while it is a unique and discrete series, a lot of the imagery, for example, imagery of butchers and food imagery, preceded and then also post-dated the Stickmen series. So for example, here I'm showing you imagery of a butcher shop from 1930. And then I'm also showing you a very late work by George Grosz from 1958, created in Huntington, where he returned to the medium of collage. And he is cutting out images of food and drinks from consumer magazines, and then collaging eyes onto it in a very kind of grotesque and stomach-turning critique of consumerism and materialism, which was all around him in post-war America. And the last characteristic of the Stickmen series that I want to call out is the figure's eyes, which are stark and fearful and unblinking. The figures are very wide-eyed throughout the Stickmen series. And the Peruvian writer Mario Vargas Llosa has described the stickmen by saying that they, quote, "stare in utter astonishment, panic, or resignation at something we can't see because it lies beyond the picture frame and perhaps is the viewers, ourselves. And I think that is such a powerful observation, that the stickmen are looking back at us, the viewer, and that we are implicated in Grosz's message and in his critique. Within the Stickmen series, there are a few really important, fascinating works that depict a stickman as an artist. And so we're looking at one of those here. As I hope you've been hearing from me so far, Grosz wanted his political art to change the world. He wanted to impact politics. By the late 1940s, however, he's been working for decades, and he's starting to question whether or not he's having an impact. And so he said, quote, "People weren't listening to my drawings. My warning had been a warning spoken into the wind." At the same time, abstract expressionism, which was a new form of gestural abstraction, kind of taking over in America and also internationally. And Grosz viewed abstract expressionism as apolitical. And so in The Painter of the Whole, Grosz is depicting a painter who once believed in something, but now he only paints a whole. And so Grosz said that this painter, endlessly painting images of a whole, is, quote, "without meaning, without anything, the nothing but nothingness, the nothingness of our time." And so Grosz is repeating that phrase over and over, nothingness, nothingness. And so this figure, the stickman artist, we can understand as Grosz himself, but we can also understand as a commentary on the state of the art world more generally. Grosz reflected, quote, "Perhaps there really isn't any form of representation for ultimate despair." However, he is still making art. So the very act of creating and exhibiting the Stickmen series, even though it wrestles with what is the role of political art, he hasn't given up on that. And he's still hoping to spur change through the Stickmen series. This is another example of the Painter of the Whole with an uprooted stickman, the roots dangling from his feet, but even on the brush that he's holding in his mouth, we see little roots dangling. So that, again, art itself has been uprooted. And we can contrast this with his earlier work. So we had talked about this work, A Mighty One on a Little Outing, Surprised by Two Poets, and really to see the difference between these two things, and see Grosz, his thoughts about political art evolving. So in Uprooted, The Painter of the Whole, the stickman artist is holding a canvas that either has a hole in it or that is a painting of a hole. And I don't know if it's possible to know the answer. But it's interesting that if you read this canvas that the stickman is holding, if you read that as a whole, as an actual negative space in the canvas, you see through, you see then that means the stickman figure's body is a hole, is a void. So we're looking right through him. Also, if you look into his mind, you will see another void. So again, this is the nothing of nothingness that Grosz was talking about. On several occasions, Grosz identified the stickman painter as himself. So he, in a letter, speaking about his career in the United States, he wrote, quote, "Here I am a poor wretch. That is the simple, exact truth. Everything else is debt, buffoonery, imposture. I play the famous artist, but behind the celebrity is a big hole." End quote. And however, it's also possible to understand this Painter of the Whole imagery as a comment on post-war art, again, which Grosz saw as apolitical. So here we see the object on the right, which is kind of hard to understand on the screen. This is actually a painting that George Grosz made on top of a wooden stool that you sit on. And then on the left, we see a George Grosz painting called The Gray Man Dances. And the stickman figure is dancing in on a muddy ground with barbed wire that actually looks a lot like a Jackson Pollock painting. So between these two works, art historians can be fairly certain that Grosz is satirizing and critiquing American abstract expressionism here. As you likely know, Pollock created his work by dripping paint onto a canvas placed on the floor. And Grosz derided this way of working. He made fun of it. He called it spaghetti painting. And when he made this painting on the stool, he was parodying Pollock. So he poured paint onto the top of a seat. He stirred it up with his brush, and then he sat on it. So this was his commentary on ABEX. We also know we have Grosz talking about ABEX in writing. So he lamented that the wildest and boldest, so-called, young painters are supported over here, meaning America. They're not suppressed, but nor are any morals expected of them. And they are not expected to serve something like the people. So through a combination of these works and Grosz's words, we hear him reacting to the so-called triumph of American expressionism, abstract expressionism. So now that we have a good understanding of the Stickmen series itself, its relation to world events and to the international art world, and its place in Grosz's body of work, I'd like to spend my remaining time situating the series in the context of Long Island and Huntington. And so I'm showing you here a photograph of Grosz in his home studio in Huntington, surrounded by works from the Stickmen series. In part due to his own self-fashioning, Grosz's Long Island life has been seen as incongruous with the savagery of his political art. Beginning in the 1930s, articles in magazines, including Life and The New Yorker and Time, contrasted the dangerous satirical drawings he created in Germany with the still lifes and the nudes and the landscapes that he painted in America. And they repeatedly juxtaposed Berlin with Bayside, Douglaston, and Huntington, suggesting that Grosz had gone soft in his art, and that this softening paralleled his quiet suburban life. And this reading really neglects his actual experiences of wartime and post-war Long Island, as if that context did not impact the Stickmen series. So I would like to argue otherwise. While Long Island was suburban, it was also home to military manufacturing and to atomic research and weapons. I've shared already that in 1946, the Grosz family moved to Huntington, which was about 25 miles from Douglaston, where they had lived previously, and Huntington is connected to Manhattan by train. By the time that they moved, World War II was over and the Cold War had begun. Some of Long Island's numerous military bases and wartime manufacturing plants, including those that produced Hellcat, Avenger, and P-47 Thunderbolt fighter planes, were idle briefly before ramping up again for the Korean War. An interesting example is the Sperry Gyroscope Company, which was based in Lake Success, right near Douglaston. And during World War II, they produced radar equipment and bomb sights for fighter planes. But then when World War II ended, from 1946 to 1951, they leased their plant to the United Nations. This was before the UN had built their home in Manhattan. The site was a tourist attraction, and its most distinctive feature was this circular arrangement of flags. So I think this is perhaps another source for Grosz's flag imagery. In the 1950s, Long Island was also studded with nuclear-tipped Nike missiles. There was a launch site near Grosz's home in Lloyd Harbor in Huntington, and this was controlled from Bayside's Fort Totten, which I mentioned briefly. And the idea was to intercept Soviet bombs while they were over Long Island, but before they reached Manhattan. And this is a page from one of Grosz's sketchbooks showing a stickman figure next to an image that Grosz has labeled atom bomb. So this is another direct evidence that he's connecting these circumstances. Grosz taught art students in Huntington. So here he is surrounded by a very accomplished group of women, many of whom were themselves war refugees and who also collected his art. And when Grosz died in 1959, he actually passed away in Berlin. At the Heckscher Museum of Art, which is where I work, mounted a memorial exhibition to him. And they did so by borrowing 91 works from Long Island collections. So I see this as a testament to the way that Grosz's work was received on Long Island. Despite the thinking that his work was not commercially successful, it was collected by at least 50 or so couples on Long Island. And Grosz's work also came to have an important home at my museum in Huntington. And so in this grainy image here, what I'm showing you is a group of high school students who in 1968 pooled their lunch money as part of a fundraising drive, really a collective community effort to purchase Eclipse of the Sun so that it could be held in the museum's collection so that Grosz would always have a presence in Huntington. And so with that, I'm excited to field any questions about what we've heard today or about George Grosz in general.
Thank you so much, Karli. This was such a rich presentation, and I'm sure the questions started actually coming in as you were speaking already, and are now really starting to come in. So Mitchell is interested in the places where George Grosz lived. His studio in Douglaston, his Bayside house, and the house in Huntington. Do they all still exist?
That is a great question. Thank you so much. So 2 of the 3 are still standing. I'll talk about them in chronological order. So the first place he lived in Bayside was a home that they rented. And unfortunately, that structure is no longer standing. And even the street numbers have changed a bit. So it's even hard to decipher where exactly where the house would have been. A lot of highways were built on Long Island in the 30s and 40s. And so things in Bayside have changed a lot. The Douglaston home is still standing. And again, it's waterfront. It's really a lovely setting. But as I described, it also meant that Grosz had this front row seat to the ramping up for World War II. And so that house still stands. I believe the address is 202 Shore Road or 202 Shore Drive. You can find that on Google Maps if you want to see a photo, or you can drive by. And then finally, the home and studio in Huntington is also still standing. And Rachel visited just last week. it's an interesting situation. So the home, Grosz would refer to it as a cottage or a carriage house. And it was, in fact, the stable for horses and then the garage on a vast Long Island estate. And then eventually the grand house and other outbuildings were torn down and the land was subdivided. However, the carriage house was spared from that demolition, but it's now owned actually by a nursing home that was constructed on that former Gold Coast estate. And so the home is standing, but is not open to the public, and it's really being used as storage. So that structure in itself really encapsulates the history of Long Island and land development on Long Island.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Yeah, so I did see the house, and I do hope that it will be bought up by the city and restored as a George Grosz museum. But that's just my dream that I had upon seeing its very sad situation right now, and that it's still standing. So. So Elizabeth is asking whether there's any evidence that Grosz participated in any of the anti-Nazi demonstrations that happened in New York City at the time when he came to New York and came to the US.
Yeah, that's a great question. I'm going to give two answers. One is that I don't know. The other answer is that I've never seen mention of that in letters or writing or in art historical scholarship. Grosz was, again, famous. He was famous in the US as someone who had opposed the Nazi Party and who had been stripped of his citizenship. And he really did remain a kind of a symbol of resistance. Whether he was attending specific rallies or protests, I don't know the answer.
Mm, yeah. We also have to remember that he was a painter, so I guess that was his outlet.
Yes.
So Stephen is asking whether he was aware of Camp Secret, and that it goes into a larger question of Elizabeth with a combination of military installations, the temporary UN. What was the political makeup of Huntington while Grosz was living there? Did he have politically aligned neighbors and supporters nearby, or was he more isolated in his beliefs?
Yeah. So I focused on the supporters and neighbors who were in sympathy with him. So there may have, undoubtedly, there were other people. In my own research, I was really interested in who were taking his classes, who was collecting his art, who was he conversing with and interacting with on a daily basis. And I came up with some fascinating results. So I basically, in the exhibition catalog I showed you from 1959, we have a list of all of the lenders, and there are about 50 people there. And I just started Googling and looking into the local Huntington newspaper, which is all digitized. And my findings were really fascinating. I mean, for example, one of the people who collected his work was one of the monuments men who was in Europe rescuing artwork and then came back to Long Island and supported Grosz. One of the women had been a war correspondent based in Hawaii in the Pacific Theater, and then she moved to Long Island. Just south of Huntington is a neighborhood called Levittown. And for those of you who study architectural history or who know about the history of suburbia, Levittown is really famous as a planned suburb. And that was a community of 17 or 18,000 single-family homes that were built specifically to house returning veterans. So, so near Grosz on Long Island were 18,000 veterans of World War II. New York State had the largest population of citizens who served in the war, the highest casualties, and also the highest percentage of returning veterans. So I was really fascinated and kind of argue in the book that the people surrounding Grosz would have viscerally understood the Stickmen series. And then also there were many Jewish refugees and political refugees and immigrants from Europe who settled in Huntington. And so I mentioned Julian Gumpertz. We also know of several other families and intellectuals who moved to Huntington, and they spoke German with one another and with the Grosses. So I concentrated on the people around him who would have been like-minded, but I think it's right to acknowledge that that there were people on other ends of the political spectrum on Huntington and in New York City.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, thank you. So the next question is, what were his ethnicity and religious beliefs? Was he connected with any Jewish community or people, either in the US or in Germany or in Israel?
Yeah. So, so Grosz was not Jewish, and so he was raised in a Christian milieu. I think many in all of his activism and all of the groups that he was organized with and part of in Berlin, I think he knew and befriended many Jewish intellectuals and artists. I don't know if he ever said anything about the state of Israel. And so I hope that answers the question. He himself was not Jewish. He was in dialogue with friends and like-minded people who were.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So Elizabeth is asking, with the exception of The Painter of the Whole, I feel as though many of Grosz's late works have received short shrift in comparison to the interwar pieces. Why do you think that is?
Yeah, let me just pull one up so we can look at something else. I think a lot of things. So, so there are many reasons for this. One is that Grosz made his reputation. As I say, he came to the US a celebrity for his political art that was anti-Nazi, and that's how he made his reputation. And so people, so that's one thing. Another thing is, at the same time, collectors, individual collectors, the commercial gallery art world, was not interested in buying this work. And you can imagine why. It would be difficult work to live with. So while some museums collected Stickmen works, they really didn't circulate broadly. Grosz did show them in New York City in 1948. Some of them entered museum collections, but they really didn't have the traction and the currency of that interwar work. And then there's at least a third factor at play here, which is that in the European context, after World War II, when there's a revisioning and a desire to celebrate the degenerate artists, the so-called degenerate artists, and to revive them and resuscitate them and celebrate them. And so again, we see art historians and the public going back to that interwar period, not so interested in what Grosz had made yesterday, literally, more interested in what was the work that had been branded degenerate art. So those are just some of the factors and some of the reasons why this work has not received a lot of art historical or popular attention.
Mm-hmm. So regarding his work, Eric is first of all thanking you for a great presentation. And he says, I find it interesting that in the work of a number of artists, René Magritte, Ludwig Meitner, Albert Camus, Samuel Beckett, an existential crisis appears not in 1945, but a few years later when disillusionment finally fully hits them. Would you say that is also true for Grosz?
Yeah, I would say, again, I want to have it both ways. So I want to say, on the one hand, Grosz was always pretty disillusioned, I think. And, you know, I think of that Cain and Abel, or Hitler as Cain image, where he's really looking at the whole sweep of human history and kind of asking, what is it about human beings that even our founding myths are revolving around this killing your brother? So on the one hand, I think he was always kind of had a jaundiced eye. But on the other hand, I think the questioner is exactly right. And Grosz is reading many of the people you just mentioned, Rachel. He's reading, and so it is really existential. I mean, it is definitely part of this post-war existential grappling with what is humanity? What have we done? What is our future? Where do we go from here? And what can art say about any of that?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, so I think it's a little bit of both.
Yeah, yeah, I agree. Um, which while we come to the next question by Kenneth, did George Grosz write a memoir, speak, and are his letters to family explanatory of his art intentions over time?
Yes, to both of those things. So he did write an autobiography. As you might expect, it is not a typical autobiography. So it's not always linear. It's not comprehensive. There are a lot of metaphors and symbols and allusions. So it's not a straightforward read, and it's not a straightforward explanation. It's like an artwork, a literary artwork unto itself. But if you're interested, I would definitely recommend it. And he does go into great detail, and it is an important historic record and artifact. And then we do have letters. And Rachel and I have chatted about this. The letters are often to his European peers. So, you know, you write letters to people you're separated from. So we don't really know what Grosz was talking about at the Art Students League or what he was talking about with his New York City colleagues because they were physically in the same space. So we do have letters. And again, those are wonderful and important resources. And I quoted from many of the quotes I shared today come from those. At the same time, it's important to remember, you know, who he's talking to. So often he's very critical of the US and he will be very disparaging about his students. He'll say that he hates teaching. And so some of that may be true, but then in his actions also sometimes say otherwise. But there is a body of archival material that we can draw from to understand the work.
Mm-hmm. And Alan is asking for about a portrait of George Grosz by Kenneth Haig in the BBC series called Omnibus in 1987, whether that episode still exists.
I can't answer that. I'm sorry, I don't know. It must be out there somewhere. I don't know where we could all find it. There is an earlier video that we show in the exhibition filmed during Grosz's lifetime, either in 1958 or 1959, filmed in Germany. And so he's speaking German. And he does discuss, this was broadcast on public television, I believe. And he does talk about his work, and it is really wonderful to hear his voice, and to see him moving, and, you know, to really see him as a living human being. And that is preserved in an archive in Berlin, but again, we have an exhibition copy in the show in Huntington. I don't think it's available online.
Right. And so that alone should be a reason to come to Huntington, because it's a really important source that's still there. Yeah. So Johanna is asking, Karli, you mentioned that Grosz was troubled by the message that expressionist artists' work seemed not to reflect in their work. How would you evaluate his work in the context of that criticism? Was he aware of, for example, of the social issues of gender and race? He essentially comes to a country that has segregation. Did he at all portray that or deal with that in his art?
Yes. So I'm thinking out loud here. One thing that is important about Grosz is that he taught at the Art Students League for decades. And so many of what are now some of the most important American artists passed through the Art Students League and had him as a teacher. And interestingly, I mean, he taught figure drawing from the female nude. I mean, he's someone who is a traditionally trained, very skilled artist and draftsman who is really steeped in art history. And so he's teaching that to his students. And one of those students is Romare Bearden, who is an African-American artist, one of the most important American artists of the 20th century. And Bearden, in an oral history interview, talks about the importance of Grosz's teaching. So certainly, I think, and also in New York City in the 30s and 40s, there are many progressive artists who are mounting anti-lynching exhibitions.
Mm-hmm.
And so I think Grosz definitely would have known about kind of the terrible racial problems of the US. He had students who were African American. And the last thing I will say is that I had mentioned Levittown. And when I talk about those 17,000 veterans, this is Long Island. So this is the North, where segregation supposedly did not exist. Levittown was for white families only. And this was widely known and reported on in the news. And this was done, you know, not by making a law or posting a sign, but it had to do with the ability to get mortgages from the bank.
Mm-hmm.
So Black people would not be able to get the home loan that would allow them to move to Levittown. So it was a very insidious and structural form of racism that Grosz would have known about. And I do believe actually, because I've been speaking with you for about an hour, I'm so sorry her name has gone right out of my mind, but a major Grosz scholar is taking up this question in her next book. Barbara McCloskey is writing about this, I think, at this moment. So hopefully we will have a new resource on this question soon.
Fabulous. Timothy is asking whether Grosz had connections with any of the other exile artists living in New York City.
Yes, I think again the answer is yes, but we don't have really much more to say about it because again we don't have those records.
Mm-hmm.
And so he definitely would have known other exile artists. At the same time, he was kind of a loner at this period. He did live out in Huntington. And, he was raising his family. And so he was, not necessarily in cafes and at parties and having conversation, all day, every day. But I would say short answer, yes.
Mm-hmm. So we'll wrap up soon. David is, so the last few questions are about his family and himself. David says he understands that Grosz went back to Berlin shortly before his death. Can you elaborate on his decision to live in Germany again?
Sure. I'm going to answer that by relaying things that I have read, and things that I haven't done my own research on. So I'm telling you what I think is true. Basically, the story goes that Gross's wife, Ava, really wanted to go back to Berlin, that she had been in the US since 1933. Germany was now rebuilding. The letters that I had shown about hunger and food, those came from Ava's sister's husband. So in other words, Ava's sister was still living in Berlin with her husband. And so she wanted to reconnect with family and to go home. And so in 1959, also the children were grown. By this time, they had graduated high school and were making their own careers. So they were empty nesters of a sort. And so in early 1959, they decide they're going to leave Huntington. They sell the house. Grosz gives away things like his easel, which we now have at the Heckscher Museum. He leaves some work with a gallerist on Long Island, but basically, he's selling his possessions and he's getting ready to move. They do go back to Berlin, and tragically, just 6 weeks after he was back in Berlin, he passed away.
Mm-hmm.
And so many of and Huntington had many parties and going away exhibitions, and he was really celebrated as he was leaving. And then all of those projects very quickly then became memorial exhibitions. And so the exhibition I was talking about at the Heckscher from 1959, gathering up work from Long Island collectors, that was organized in memory of him.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Wow. So, did the children remain in the US, and are they artists? And that should be the last question because we very much went over time.
Okay. Yeah, it's super interesting to think about these things. So, his two sons did not become artists, visual artists. His older son, I believe, became an academic and specialized, interestingly, in World War I.
Mhm.
And his younger son, I know, became a jazz musician, so an artist of a sort. But neither of them followed directly in their father's footsteps. And they did make their lives in America and marry American women, but they also would go to Berlin and to Europe for extended trips.
Mhm. Wonderful. Thank you so much, Karli. You really developed a very rich impression of George Grosz's art and his life, and where he lived in Long Island, in Huntington, and beyond. So, thank you so much. I want to just reconnect with what Eric has said. Read a short quote. At night, I hear Europe. I hear cries of fear from thousands of miles away, the smell of distant fires and blood. And I do not, that is a quote from George Grosz. Unfortunately don't know from when, but I do believe that even after 45, he experienced that, because it was, the most deadly war in world history. And I think it had a very long, afterlife is not the right word, but it, you know, it resonated with a huge population for many, many years, if not until now.
Yes.
So thank you so much, Karli.